While I've talked a lot about songs and records on my channel, it's not very often I talk about what-if stories. In today's video, we're talking about Van Halen's second record with Gary Cherone that was unreleased. This album has been shrouded in mystery and speculation, and it represents a fascinating chapter in the band's storied history. Despite the commercial and critical disappointment of Van Halen 3, their first record with Cherone, the band intended on working on a follow-up album with the frontman. The only problem was that the wheels eventually came off the whole thing. Today, let's explore the background, the music, and the legacy of this unreleased record. Gary Cherone joined Van Halen during a pretty turbulent time. The band had parted ways with frontman Sammy Hagar by 1996. Sammy claimed he was fired, while the Van Halen brothers claimed he left on his own. Eddie told an interviewer that the split was due to Hagar not wanting to tour and disputes over appearing on the soundtrack for the 1996 film Twister. Sammy was about to have a baby with his wife, while the Van Halen brothers were dealing with a bunch of medical issues. Eddie needed hip surgery, while his brother Alex was having issues with his neck. It was following the tour to support their 1995 album Balance. Sammy thought the band should take some time off while the Van Halen brothers addressed their medical concerns, and then they could regroup to work on what would have been their next album. But Van Halen soon got a lucrative offer to record music for the soundtrack of the upcoming 1996 blockbuster film Twister. The offer resulted in the #1 hit Humans Being, but it proved to be a sonic farewell for Hagar, who departed the band the same year. It was by June of '96 Hagar left the group, and apparently another source of contention was the compilation Best Of album that the band wanted to put out, which featured tracks from the David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar era of the band. Here's what Sammy told Loudwire.
Sammy, it says on Wikipedia that you disagreed with the decision to record 2 Van Halen tracks for the soundtrack to the film Twister, after the band had agreed to take time off following your 1995 world tour.
I didn't disagree with doing 2 tracks for Twister. I disagreed with doing 2 new tracks for Greatest Hits record.
Oh,
because we had never done one at that time, and I didn't think that we should be cashing in yet. I thought we still had another good record in us, and everybody wanted to just do, not everyone, the new manager who came in wanted us to do a Greatest Hits record with both Dave's era and my era, and then 2 new songs for me, and not to my knowledge at the time, and then 2 new songs from Dave, which never happened at the time, so they ended up with just the 2 new songs from me, blah, 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 blah. And we ended up using another one for Twister, and that was the end of the band. It kind of broke the band up. It was because I wanted to do a whole record. I didn't want to do a Greatest Hits record. I didn't think Van Halen was there yet.
Okay, so there was never an aversion to do a movie about a tornado?
That was fine.
Okay, that was all good. Okay.
The song for the movie, that's just fun. I like soundtrack movies.
According to Eddie in 1998, Sammy didn't want to be compared to David Lee Roth, with Eddie telling Night Rider News Service that some of the band's fans thought their 1995 release Balance was the group's first record, adding, "We have 12 and 14-year-old fans who didn't know the history of the band. We actually did it for the fans as opposed to what he says for the money." He himself has 2 greatest hits out, adding in the same interview that Hagar was asked to be a team player and refused, and so he left the band. Van Halen soon recorded 2 new songs with their old singer David Lee Roth for their Best Of Volume 1 compilation, Can't Get the Stuff No More and Me Wise Magic. Excitement grew about a possible reunion with Roth, with the band even making an appearance with the frontman at the 1996 MTV Video Music Awards. MTV, for a period of time, even started running welcome back spots. But Eddie later remarked that the band was never planning on reuniting with David Lee Roth for a tour or a new album, and the press simply blew everything out of proportion. Behind the scenes, things were also getting ugly between Dave and Eddie.
Well, what happened at the MTV Awards that changed the nature of your relationship with David?
It wasn't his onstage antics, which for one I thought was embarrassing.
And disrespectful to Beck?
Very disrespectful to Beck, as he's trying to thank, people, his acceptance speech, whatever. Dave's behind him doing his shtick, and it's like, I don't know. To me, it was embarrassing. But it was more so backstage, where he basically spit in my face. We get shuffled off to the first mob press conference, and everyone, yelling, screaming questions, and Dave just wasn't answering any of them. He was doing his up and bop and best piece with the pops. So I just kind of walked up and said, look, everybody, here's what's happening. 2 songs, best of volume 1. One of us would like us to do 2 videos, and that is it. If you think we're going on tour in the summer, forget it.
It was at the MTV VMAs. The band talked a lot in the press about focusing on Eddie Van Halen's hip surgery, while David reportedly said backstage, "Tonight is expletive about me, not Eddie's hip." All while this was happening, Gary Cherone claimed he was already in Van Halen, but it hadn't been announced yet to the press. Gary also indicated that Roth may have been used to drum up interest in the band's Best of Volume 1 release, with Cherone telling Rolling Stone in 2012, "I remember one morning getting up to go to the studio, and no one told me all this press was interviewing the Van Halen guys because of the VMAs and all this stuff. They told me, Gary, no one knows you're in the band. I remember bumping into a photographer from Japan, and he knew me from Extreme. He goes, 'What are you doing here?' I go, 'Nothing.'" So how did Cherone end up in Van Halen to begin with? Well, his band Extreme, who were of course best known for the early 90s hit More Than Words, had disbanded earlier in the year. It was by the summer of 96, the frontman received a surprising phone call from his manager Ray Daniels to audition for Van Halen. It turned out he shared the same manager as the guys from Van Halen. Cherone was shocked by the offer, but thought nothing would really come of it except for maybe a good story to tell people. He recalled to Rolling Stone that he landed in LA remembering, "I got off the plane in the afternoon and I remember Michael Anthony came out. I'd met him over the years at some Extreme shows. I said, 'Mike, hey man, you're my only ally here.'" Despite initial concerns that he'd be viewed as a strange choice by fans, he was welcomed by the band with open arms, adding, "Alex and Eddie came out and shook my hand. And Ed goes, 'You ready to sing?' Then we literally went into 5150, 3 other songs from the Hagar catalog, and Jump and Panama from the Dave era." In an interview that Eddie gave in 1998, he claimed after they went through the band's back catalog, the group wrote their first song with Cherone in just 45 minutes, the track Without You. The parties hit it off, and Cherone could sense Eddie's renewed excitement. They soon started writing a handful of other songs, and before he knew it, Cherone was officially asked to join the band, which of course he did. Van Halen seemed reborn and reinvigorated with a new frontman and with the songwriting process. While the music normally came first when writing songs for the group, for Van Halen 3, things worked a bit differently. Eddie told Guitar World, "I've been making music for 37 or 38 years and never has somebody handed me lyrics to work with. This record is the biggest milestone in my life because the lyrics came first, then the music. Finally had something to bounce off." Eddie added in a separate interview, "I think Van Halen 3 is the best incarnation of the band." Meanwhile, drummer Alex Van Halen spoke with the Courier News from New Jersey, admitting that following Hagar's departure in 96, the band wasn't sure what they wanted to do next. It wasn't until they got together with Cherone that they realized they still had unfinished business and wanted to put out another Van Halen album. The album Van Halen 3 covered topics like cynicism, materialism, as well as communication. Van Halen, in doing press for the record, talked a lot about the maturity of the band and not following trends at the same time. Bassist Michael Anthony added that while Van Halen was known primarily as a party band for many years, they'd also matured, stating, "We want fans to know that there's more to Van Halen than just writing about female body parts." And Eddie brought in his friend producer Mike Post to work on the album. He had worked on a lot of TV show soundtracks, being responsible for themes like Law and Order, so he initially seemed like a strange choice. Released in March of 1998, Van Halen 3 debuted at the number 4 spot on the Billboard 200 chart, ending the band's streak of number 1 albums and platinum-selling records. In fact, all of their releases with Sammy Hagar hit number 1. Van Halen 3 featured longer and more lyrically intricate songs, with Michael Anthony claiming Eddie's heavy involvement on the writing and the production side made it feel more like an Eddie solo record. Eddie even played most of the bass tracks on the album, and to the surprise of many fans, played piano and did lead vocals on the final track, How Many Say I. How many say I? How many? The lead single from Van Halen 3, Without You, ended up topping the mainstream rock tracks chart, while Fire in the Hole was another top 10 hit. But commercially, the album didn't have legs. It only went gold, which was a huge disappointment for the band and their label. Eddie, though, brushed off the record's commercial performance by telling the interviewer, "We're a rock and roll peg trying to fit in a pop spice world." There were even reports in 1998 that the band's label, Warner Brothers, had rejected the album initially, and that several producers were brought in, but the band rejected these stories. The tour to support the album seemed to be better received, with Cherone telling Ultimate Classic Rock, "We'd go into a town, and the radio station there would be some mocking, Gary Cherone, the more than words ballad guy. What's he doing in Van Halen?" But those same radio people saw the show, and then after that, we'd see them, and they were apologizing. Maybe those guys didn't know who Extreme was. While the shows were getting good reviews, the ticket sales didn't back it up. But the band did dig a little deeper into the Roth-era catalog, with Cherone adding, "It's funny, it was kinda pre-YouTube. But there were rumors going around, oh, they're playing Mean Street for the first time in 20 years, so that worked in my favor," he'd remark. There was even an interview Cherone gave to the LA Times in 1998 while promoting the record where he stated, "It seems like every 10 years they kick out the singer, so I've got 8 or 9 years to misbehave." Fast forward 1 year later, Van Halen regrouped at Eddie's 5150 Studios to work on what would have been their second album with Cherone. According to a post on the band's website at the time from May 19th of that year, the band had recorded nearly 24 tracks. Cherone recalled some of the names of those songs, including Left for Dead, Say Uncle, and You Wear It Well. Cherone referred to Left for Dead as one of the most up-tempo songs the band had done. Say Uncle was apparently about a relationship between a submissive man and a dominant woman. The band first enlisted Madonna and Pink Floyd producer Patrick Leonard. Cherone described their 1999 material as being, and I quote, "really good stuff." They soon, however, changed producers, enlisting Danny Korchmar. A few months after posting their initial update, the band revealed they were spending 6 days a week in the studio on their forthcoming record. So what happened? Despite a promising start, the project began to unravel due to personal issues within the band. According to Cherone, during his 3-year stint in Van Halen, Eddie was mostly sober, but he admitted the guitarist started drinking again, telling Rolling Stone, "Ed was good. Towards the end, he got a little dysfunctional, but he was no way close to how he was in 2004. A couple songs were fully developed and were the best things that we did. I look back on some of those demos and I go, you know what? This should have been the first record." Because the critique of Van Halen 3 is that maybe it was a little too different. This, coupled with some personal stuff that Cherone was going through, ultimately resulted in the sessions coming to an end in November of '99. As for how far those demos got, Cherone explained to Ultimate Classic Rock, "We worked with a couple different producers, all different degrees of production. Most of them were a riff, a rough drum track, a vocal that I put on, I might have thrown a harmony on it. A couple of the songs were fully developed and were the best things that we did." But in November of '99, Cherone went home to Boston for a few weeks and then finally returned to LA. He remarked to Rolling Stone that the band maybe was thinking about reuniting with David Lee Roth, as they had fired their then manager. It ultimately ended with Cherone sitting down with Alex Van Halen, who told him, "We sense that you're a little unhappy and a little bit frustrated. I was playing the diplomat. It wasn't crazy dysfunction because we all could talk. But there was an unhappiness and they wanted to move in a different direction, and I was cool with it. I really was." He added he parted ways with Van Halen on good terms and still managed to talk to Eddie in the subsequent years. But over time, he stopped communicating completely with the guitarist, as the Van Halen camp was pretty small and insular. Looking back, while he loved his time in Van Halen, Cherone did feel some regret. He did claim that Extreme ended too soon, and his heart was always with that band. In an interview with Eddie, Axl Rose owes me an interview Trung claims to have heard some of that material on their 1999 album. Here's what he said.
"Those are my choices." Well, fair enough, Chad. Yeah, and I was one of the ones that just said, wow, Van Halen 3. Look, I've said a million times, Cherone got a raw deal. Cherone gets blamed for that album, and he was the new guy in the band. It's Eddie's band. It was what Eddie wanted to do. I heard the demos of what would have been the second Van Halen record with Cherone. It was night and day. And I've said this and I'll say it again. Gary live, I thought singing was great in that band because he was the only guy that could and would equally sing Roth and Hagar.
Cherone did share some regret about his time in Van Halen. He told Rolling Stone that the band didn't feel like a group until they really hit the road and started bonding and playing shows. He speculates they should have toured first before recording Van Halen 3, and it likely would have resulted in a better record. One of the tracks from those aborted 1999 sessions with Cherone has come out in a different form. Left for Dead was released by Cherone's band Tribe for Judah. Looking back at the Gary Cherone era of the band, bassist Michael Anthony described it as strange. Possibly contributing to his assessment was that the band didn't record together in the studio a lot, resulting in what he thought was a disjointed album. One of the contributing factors, according to the bassist, was that drummer Alex Van Halen was going through a divorce, recalling how the band would be in the studio together for only a half an hour, with Alex having to leave to meet with his lawyer. As for how that 1999 material sounded, he told Ultimate Guitar it sounded a bit more Van Halen rock oriented than it did on Van Halen 3 album. After a 5-year hiatus following Cherone's departure, Van Halen reunited with Hagar to record 3 new songs for another greatest hits album. Then they embarked on an ill-fated 2004 summer tour that resulted in Hagar once again leaving the group. Then in 2007, the group reunited with Roth, but fired bassist Michael Anthony, who was replaced by Eddie's son Wolfgang on bass. They'd tour several more times and released their first album with Roth in 28 years, and their first new album in 14 years with 2012's A Different Kind of Truth. The story of what would have been Van Halen's second album with Gary Cherone is a fascinating chapter in the band's history. It represents a period of creative exploration and personal challenges that ultimately led to the project's demise. While we'll never know exactly how the album may have sounded, the demos and descriptions of the tracks give a little bit of a glimpse into what could have been. Let me know your thoughts on Van Halen 3 and your thoughts on what could have been their second album with Gary Cherone in the comment section below, and we'll see you again, Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.